starting with some of these factors and trends, and should preface it by saying that I'm an expert in none of these. I'm an armchair observer of most of them. There are people in this room that probably know more than I do about various of these. And I think with each one that I present, there are some big question marks about how big a factor they'll be and how it'll shake out. But they're things that are important to be aware of as we think about the future of our land. So one is this moment of grand energy transition. And this is something that we thought a lot about at PUSH. And some folks, essentially have PhDs at PUSH in this. I was always sort of getting the info secondhand and trying to piece together where we're going. But the big picture is, since the Edison era, since the birth of hydropower, and then also the coal as a generating resource for our energy, meaning our electricity. We've been operating on the big utility model of making energy in a big plant and then putting it out in a grid through the electrical lines or through the piping that the natural gas companies use. So it's sort of been a factory production distributed across hundreds of miles of residential and commercial customers. And because of a few concurrent dynamics, that model is very rapidly changing. One big reason is the cost of solar has dropped so much. The efficiency of solar has risen really rapidly. So it's essentially on par with most other ways of producing electricity already. And if you add to the regulatory framework that even in our terrible environmental policy context is already impacting the coal industry and other industries, and also the way capital is thinking about the future of those industries, whether they're going to be viable long term because of climate change and because of cost. We have this reality of a whole new energy system in cities emerging, and in a nutshell, this is like a basic model of it. It's built on a lot of what are called distributed energy resources, and that means very localized ways of producing electricity: solar, wind, geothermal, other renewable sources that can be produced in a very decentralized and localized way. So the simplest way to think about it is rooftop solar. You can see that in Buffalo starting to take hold. In some parts of the country, it's really taken hold. And the idea is, along with the development of battery and localized management load technology, so the idea that you could feed the electricity from your roof into a battery and manage your electricity load locally, which is becoming a reality, certainly in big institutions. It's already a reality in a lot of major institutions across the country. And those are called microgrids. They manage their loads locally. Why is that important for the future of cities? Well, one reason is that it's a potential to democratize a big sector of wealth and power in our political economy. So we know that energy companies have been really the dominant political force in our democracy nationally for the last 30, 40 years. If you think about our presidents and how closely tied they all have been to energy and oil and gas and coal. And all the wealth that comes from that, we have a big chance to bring more wealth to our neighborhoods through owning our generation and distribution technology, or not. And the or not is, you can see examples of utilities realizing that this is happening. We have one, in my opinion, in the Fruit Belt right now, where a utility has gone forward and put solar on a lot of roofs, which is a good thing. But they own it, right? They own the resource, and it gets put back into their centralized distribution system. So that's the sort of preemptive move that they're making all across the country. So that's all I'm going to say about that factor. Climate impact's obviously a huge factor, mostly I believe in our case of in-migration. So, the chances are, the experts who look at this say that we're probably going to be one of the better places to live as bigger and bigger coastal impacts hit because of climate change, flooding, storms, and so forth. So, we're likely to see people gravitating here, both because it's safer and because land markets will start to signal what capital thinks is safer. So once Harvard, which it's now, I think it's its second report this year, saying that Buffalo is the second most climate resistant city in the country. People on Wall Street, banks read that, developers read that, and they think, well, maybe that's a place to put more capital.
Where is that?
What's that?
Where is that?
Yeah, so that's New Orleans. I wasn't sure if it was Houston or New Orleans. I forgot when that slide, but that's New Orleans.
So is that the ninth ward?
I'm afraid I don't know. We could. It's just.
Geography people, kind of on down.
I-10 is the I-10.
Another transition is water. We know Atlanta and the cities in the Southwest are really hard up for water. This is just one way of looking at it. It's probably not the best way, but we could see water costs rising in cities. It's less likely to happen here, so it's another case of in-migration potential, so people moving here over time. How quickly will water hit $200 in Santa Fe a month? I don't know.
That's
but
the
yeah, that's
family house bill?
Yes.
Okay.
And so, I don't know the pace of this, but it's a long-term trend that will hit Buffalo over time. Changing gears a little bit, I mentioned this last class too. Another sort of dynamic is how quickly certain, especially older inner-ring suburban markets, housing markets, will collapse in the way that urban markets collapsed 30, 40 years ago because of aging and because of, really you can see it in retail and commercial real estate first, in part because of online retail and the Amazons of the world, but also because the demographics in certain older suburbs are they're aging very rapidly, and you're seeing abandonment. I think this region, there are inner ring suburbs where these impacts are being felt, and there's some others where they aren't being felt. We know that vacancy, and maybe Maria or Jocelyn can speak to this, around Cheektowaga. I know it was rising pretty rapidly 5 years ago, 4 years ago. I don't know if it still is, but it seems like a trend. I don't know. Would you want to say something quick about that, Jocelyn?
It is one of the tougher, and I think the combination of the taxes being so high, and that leads to the landlords purchasing the properties, renting them, but then realizing they just can't make their margin, so they're not adding any value to the home. The taxes are outrageous, and then they kind of end up just abandoning or leaving the house. So it's a huge problem. It's almost a perfect storm in Cheektowaga too. You've got the demographics. People are aging. Lots of people are passing away, and their kids aren't taking over their homes. So the demographics, and then it's kind of, there was a lot with mortgage foreclosure as well, just because it was a place where maybe people really reached to get that mortgage, and maybe took on a little bit more than they thought that they could. So people also lost their homes that way. So it really is, there's so many different things going on.
So that's a great listing of the dynamics, and Cheektowaga isn't alone nationally, and probably not even locally. There are parts of West Seneca, parts of Amherst, parts of Blaisdell, certainly parts of Lackawanna, that are feeling these effects. And what's the implication of them? Probably multiple implications, but one is that if it collapses further, that market will be seen as unviable, just in the way that a lot of Buffalo real estate was seen as unviable, and people will have to decide, I'm going to move further out to get my first mortgage, or will I move back in? And it may be a split between those two.
And I want to put in a good word for, Cheektowaga, the services really are excellent. They have excellent senior services. They have, the schools I can't really speak to. I'm not not sure, how good the schools are. But, the snow removal, all of those things that you do pay tax dollars for, they do offer those services, but if it's at a point where they're so expensive, people can't afford to pay them, what do you do?
And I would say, so just on that note, Jocelyn, that there isn't any certainty about this particular trend. I think, there were signs 10, 15 years ago that like Kenmore might be aging really rapidly as well. And you can see just in the last 5, 10 years, a lot of younger families are moving there and kind of repopulating and turning over the generation that was passing away. So again, there isn't
atmosphere.
And there's a walkability to that and so forth. But the point for this exercise is just to think about the buffalo land and whether some of the dynamics on the outskirts of Buffalo will increase demand for that land in a repopulation sense. Marie, did you want to say one quick thing?
I gather that that's a mall.
Yes, sorry. I love dead mall photography. I'm sorry to subject people to it, but
so what's interesting about that is the Erie County ECIDA has a committee that's studying adaptive reuse, and it used to be the case that adaptive reuse was really focused on vacant and abandoned buildings in the city of Buffalo, which could be reused for the purposes of housing, largely in the downtown corridor. And now we are seeing a real pivot to what to do with vacant and abandoned malls. And it is almost nothing to do with, not nothing, but increasingly nothing to do with repopulating vacant and abandoned structures in the city center.
Interesting.
And instead,
yeah, so that's a sign of the trend for
it
sure.
Is.
Thanks for that. One more elevator.
Wow.
I think Jocelyn kind of already enumerated these, but this one is sort of this one is a little bit ridiculous because I don't know. In bigger cities, this is actually a huge conversation right now. And it's not just autonomous vehicles, it's also rideshare vehicles and how that relates to autonomous vehicles. The implication for urbanism and Buffalo land is that there's a growing debate, like in a city like DC. The early days of rideshare and the promise of autonomous vehicles was less traffic because people wouldn't all own cars and they'd only use cars when they needed them. The reality is a lot more traffic and a lot more congestion so far in the places that use a lot of rideshare. And I say rideshare and autonomous because that's the idea is that those kind of futures would converge over time, and we'd be taking cars from point to point that were autonomous, but rideshare autonomous. And the basic reason is that people are using less public transportation in big cities, and they're relying more on individual cars that are rideshare cars, and that's creating a lot of congestion. So what's the implication of that for Buffalo? It could mean if rideshare really takes over and or autonomous takes over, that what you're seeing in bigger cities where people are wanting to live even closer, it's even worse congestion than had been in Atlanta 10 years ago, because now there are even more cars on the road and less public transit use. So
I just think it's important to mention there was a program held by UB recently, like 3-4 months ago. They brought in people from all walks of life. There was a couple hundred people. They did this presentation. They showed the benefits. They showed the disasters. And at the end of the whole situation, even though we were supposed to talk about how this was going to work into public transit, most people decided that they would only use this for private cars. Mm-hmm. They would never use it for public transportation. Mm-hmm.
So just weigh that however you think it is when you're doing your visioning. Another trend that I talked about a little bit in just the whole model of the neoliberal city is the concentration of ownership that we're starting to see in Buffalo. It's well along in bigger cities. So commodification of housing is, rather than just thinking of housing primarily as something you use getting the use value out of it and buying it individually, bigger and bigger aspects of finance, hedge funds and big banks are buying up single families for investment vehicles and putting them together and then packaging them and doing the kinds of crazy things that we saw in the financial crisis. So, the stat I believe was we're upwards of 10 to 15% of single families in the U.S. are now hedge fund owned, which was unheard of. That was not even an asset that big banks or hedge funds would ever have considered. And they buy it because they think that people are going to have trouble getting mortgages and there's going to be more renters, so they're going to have to rent from these major corporations. And they, believe that kind of through monopolizing regional markets, they're intense in Atlanta, Southern California, that they'll be able to hike rents over time and make a profit. It seems like a very messy business to try to manage all these little houses. The other types of commodified housing are just on the rental side. We've always had some semblance of concentrated ownership, but that's consolidating even more rapidly just in the last few years. So a place like Manhattan, you've got 60-70% of rental units are owned by very large capital holders, not the mom and pop, landlord that owns one or two buildings, but a lot of consolidation. For Buffalo, what does that mean? It might mean more booms and busts. That's one thing that comes to mind for me. Meaning, we're seeing a lot of capital flowing in right now into these converted buildings that are becoming high rent buildings, and I have a map up here later. But it may be very speculative capital based on the idea of turning these old buildings into assets on someone's balance sheet that's very far away, and having a long view of it and putting the capital in and maybe overcapitalizing them. So that's one possibility. We might have some vacant luxury buildings. The other possibility is just, if this were ever to move into our single family market, it's another way of pushing up rents, because that they sort of create a monopoly or an oligopoly in the market and decrease the kind of decentralized competition that Buffalo's had. Did you want to say something?
I was just going to say that if climate models are correct in all this, this could easily start happening to agricultural land in the region, right? So I know that there are a few people around here who talk about the potential pressure on regional agricultural land, which right now is cheap and rather plentiful, and obviously that's not a Buffalo thing, but more Western New York thing, but some kind of speculation on land before sort of agricultural production.
Yeah, so that's a good point. Some of it is just purely speculative, and we see that around Buffalo with some local developers, the Ellicott Development owning a lot of land that they're not even sure what they're going to do with. But as Buffalo becomes more of a point of interest for developers, we'll see more and more national capital. I already showed that that's the Hudson Yards. That's sort of the ultimate example of commodified housing.
I wanted to just add one more point for us
Sure.
all to think about, I think, when we eventually do this exercise, is when you talked about the commodification of housing. A big part of it is that since the housing crisis of 10 years ago, construction levels have never rebounded. So there's just a shortage of supply of housing, and nobody's building it because it's too expensive.
That's totally, yeah.
And we're struggling with that so much here, even just trying to build small, right-sized homes that you can build for under, at this point, last year it was 200,000, now it's going up to 220, 230. I mean, you can't build an 11 or 1,200 square foot house like we're trying to build on demolition sites where they've knocked down houses in the past.
Right.
And you can't do it. So that's why they're buying up all these. They don't have a choice because nothing's being built.
Yep. No, that's
so
a great.
I think
we
really have to think about that here because the construction costs are ridiculous. There's a lot of expertise that we don't have. There aren't enough people that have the expertise to build, and the costs are really high. So
that's a great point.
We need a supply, and we don't have it.
Does that translate to people just sitting on the land, just buying the land and not
That's possible. I mean, that's possible because it's really onerous, to find somebody to build it and to build it for a reasonable price.
But
So
I'm saying it's not.
they're
it's
waiting.
not
They're
stopping
waiting.
people
You're
from
right. They're
buying
waiting
it.
for things to pencil out.
Yep.
They're gonna hold it until
Yep.
it pencils out, but it's not penciling out. I don't know when it will.
Yeah.
So, just, in this kind of quixotic list of things, I do actually think this one is kind of important for Buffalo. Student debt just superseded auto and credit card debt as the number 2 form of debt in the U.S. And some colleges are really feeling the pinch of that, of being over leveraged essentially, because their product is totally unaffordable to most people, and the debt bubble will burst at some point. This was like Hampshire College last year, which is like a 150-year-old college, essentially closed down. They're back open a little bit. This is in Western Mass, but there are a good number of colleges. I'm not going to name names here, but that we know in the region are kind of on the edge of viability, and that could actually have a downward effect on our housing market in this region. So I think we have 5
colleges here in Buffalo that you're saying?
Yeah, I mean there are definitely 2 or 3 that are struggling. Yeah, I mean, I don't know it well enough to put it on. I guess I'm on YouTube now, so I don't want to say, but you can read the news yourself about downsizing and people coming in with kind of big gifts to help get things going in the smaller colleges.
What is the number 1 form of debt?
It's mortgage.
debt?
It's still housing debt.
It's still
Yeah.
housing debt.
Yeah.
So it was housing.
It was
and then
housing, then
consumer credit,
and then auto.
vehicle.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Do you know where medical falls?
I bet it's the next one after that 5. Yeah. So, I already talked about this, but there are definite signs in the national housing market. Some of the biggest cities, Seattle has already started to fall off in that, they were at $3,700 a month rent, or maybe $3,100 average, and so they're started to tail off a little bit. But we could see, and the point of this slide is really to go back to that the idea that some of the capital moving into Buffalo is speculative and risky. Some of the buildings we see going up are not full, and it could get overbuilt, right? And so that would be that could be like a downward pull on the market at some point if some of them go through bankruptcy or go offline. A form of that is, I don't know if that's the Seattle, starting to see some declines in that market. This one is more of a justice-based. I'm not sure how it hits land exactly, but it's a big one for Buffalo economically. There are, many folks who, in the decades when selling cannabis and growing cannabis was illegal, were persecuted and imprisoned, but persisted in trying to survive through the cannabis economy. And that is going to be transitioning depending on what model we use or not, because we thought that the underground economy would go away in places like California and Colorado, and it hasn't. But the point is, there are whole classes of folks who survived off of growing and selling cannabis who are going to be under threat through corporate, much larger capitalized ways of selling cannabis, and we're already seeing that in Buffalo. We see a big, factory primed to be the biggest producer in Buffalo on the waterfront. I think they have a contract on the land. It's not county land; it's city land. Lakeside Commerce Park, and that has big wealth impacts on neighborhoods. And we don't know how it'll play out exactly yet, but that's something to be aware of in our urban future. I just, because we're talking about Buffalo Commons a lot, I was just Googling around the future charter schools in Buffalo, and one is opening up next year called Buffalo Commons. The charter trend in Buffalo continues to grow. Why is this important to the future of land in our neighborhoods? Well, one thought about charters and the privatization of public schools is that some part of the charter structure would be or will be carved out for privileged white middle class folks, as has happened in some cities. Buffalo, we haven't seen that in a tremendous way yet, but that has happened in other cities. And that's one way that the land and property in Buffalo will increase in value. One of the main reasons that white middle class people still move out, the stated reason is for schools at a certain age. I know in my generation I saw a lot of that still. Sort of basically it's racist idea of where good schooling is, but combined with some realities of test scores and where people can get perceive themselves to getting a better education. So, you could imagine a future of a completely charterized Buffalo public school system where a lot of folks are shoved out of it, and privileged folks are welcomed into it. And that's not too hard to imagine because there are cities where that's happened. So just a factor to know about. This goes without saying, but one factor is how strong our movement is for community control of land, and that's what we're kind of in this room to talk about and move towards the exercise about today. Denise has been part of a movement for community control of land. Push folks have in this room too. Jocelyn's another form of public control of land. Keith has some public control of land. So how all that plays out, we'll have a lot to say about the future of Buffalo. And I hope if there's any theme to my class, it's that. It's that we have a lot at stake in our movements. This is just another future of cities one, and the hope is that we're going to have a lot more returning citizens in coming years. We have each year through campaigns that groups like PPG and others in Buffalo run, meaning that some of the people who've been taken from our cities and incarcerated over, the percentage-wise, the percentage of the population, a bigger percentage of the population will be home in our neighborhoods, and the question is, will there be affordable housing in places that people grew up in, or will people have to make choices to move to declining suburbs or elsewhere? Another factor in my mind is how much wealth work provides for low-income people living in cities and what rent that enables them to pay. So Fight for 15 is a big one in Buffalo. I believe it may be having the biggest impacts here from any city because $15 still means more in Buffalo than it means in New York City. And so we have, I go to Tim Hortons a lot. We have a whole sector of the economy now that is almost making a living wage and should be able to pay, a little bit more in rent. And the idea is the more wealth that people have in neighborhoods, the greater the chances that they'll be able to stay in neighborhoods that they want to stay in, or not, or leave. But it's a factor. This one is a big one in my mind, a big factor about the future of land and housing in Buffalo. And I think of Jocelyn with what you just said about this too. It's one thing to imagine building housing on all this land that we're about to talk about, and the map that Keith made for us. It's another thing to have the capacity to do it. And sadly, we are very undercapacitated in the affordable housing sector in Buffalo, whether you're talking middle income or lower income. When it comes to claiming some of the state's resources that enable us to build housing, we don't have enough high capacity groups doing the work, and that could have, if we're talking about the next 10 years being a crucial time to define the class and race culture of neighborhoods, a lot of it will be about, can we build enough affordable housing to keep people, good affordable housing to keep people in Buffalo. This one, I think I just have a few more. There's a big movement nationally around, what is an anchor institution? It's the Buffalo State College, Kaleida Health, Roswell Park, any big institution that's got a lot of public money in it, employs a lot of people that can't move. It's not, different from Bethlehem Steel, because Bethlehem could close up shop. Clyda Health can't move. It's here or else it goes out of business, right? So there's been a big movement in cities, and again, Fruit Belt folks and Push folks were working on this and still do in different ways around what can these big institutions commit to that would ameliorate or mitigate the effects of their growth on neighborhoods. Could they contribute to an affordable housing trust fund? Could they think about their transportation policies so that people still can park in their neighborhoods, like the Fruit Belt folks? Can they commit to hiring locally so people can walk to work and get jobs in these institutions? And some cities are further along in this than we are, and I think the extent to which we can get some real commitments from these institutions to support communities in their environs will make those communities stronger and more resilient. A big unknown is whether these clusters that we see growing, especially as in meds, meaning universities and hospitals, research institutions, and banks, whether that growth that we've seen in the last 5 years will continue. That's an unknown. In Buffalo, that we've got 1,000 more M&T workers coming downtown. We've got more and more workers on the medical campus, and these are some of the folks that seem to be able to pay for these high rent apartments. Another unknown, we've had Santa Claus here for the last 5 years of governor who's sort of banked on the political strategy of bringing a lot of public money both to corporations and to nonprofits in Buffalo. Cuomo in the last 5-6 years, billions of dollars, and that isn't, there's no guarantee that will continue, right? And there are definitely arguments that money is propping up certain projects and institutions and markets in ways that we may see a downturn in some of them. I think one more housing bubble thing. We mentioned this last time, but we do have our biggest landlord in federal court right now. Robert Morgan, I think, is 4,000 to 5,000 units of housing in the region. Things like that. Not just him, but if another big holder of apartments comes into trouble and has to liquidate. Yeah. So we don't know where all these folks are going. I'm not going to do that. Last few. I don't know how many people have heard of Torbuff Chester. It's the most awkward sounding name. So Richard Florida, who's this pop urbanist or pop sociologist, he kind of always needs a new shtick. And about 2 years ago, mega regions was his new shtick. It's not entirely irrational to think about it, but we think of ourselves in this sort of 260,000 person city, million person region. Richard Florida made the point that we're in a 7 million person mega region, and it's basically the third biggest on the continent. The one that's a stretch, I think. There's some funny names like Hugh Orleans or Charlanta, but Shy Pitts to me is that's too big of that's from Chicago to Pittsburgh. That's not but the point is that ours is pretty substantial. And I talked yesterday about the arrival of Toronto Capital to Buffalo. So a lot of money flowing in right now from some of the bigger projects. I just read about another one today, the Henry Stimpson, who owns the former Adams Mark, former Hilton, who's, he's doing the Kaufman Bakery building at Main and Fillmore. There are buildings all over the place with Toronto money coming in, and a friend of mine, I talked to him about it with him this week, and he said, well, think about it. There's Toronto, it's hard to invest. It's kind of grown to a point where, it seems built out, and you're investing on the margin. So if you want to invest in a city, it's a lot closer to Montreal, right? You can come down and see your properties and and sort of be part hands-on in the planning process and drive back home at the end of the day. So that's one of the implications of being in a mega region with a lot of capital, is that the capital starts looking around. And I saw this in Boston too, with some outskirts cities that seem like, well, no one's ever going to invest here, and all of a sudden the Boston capital goes up there and buys up a lot of buildings. So Denise.
I was very surprised, just got back from the weekend from the New York City tour, and see that Toronto Dominion Bank is settling in Albany. I was like, what the heck are you doing with Toronto Dominion Bank?
Yeah.
But I mean, it was shocking for me just when I saw the logo from a distance, because I knew what it was.
Yeah, I remember that reminds me that they were rumored to be interested in buying up some of our local banks too. So there's a big finance in that city. So before we do our exercise, just a few ways of thinking about community control of land. We're not the first people to ever consider this question. One of the more exciting frameworks that I've come across is actually in Jackson, Mississippi. Comes out of the Black Land Liberation Movement, and really the mayorship of Chokwe Lumumba, who's pictured there. He passed away, but his son is now mayor. And long before he became mayor of Jackson, which is Mississippi's biggest city, done a lot of thinking around land and ownership. So I'm not going to be, won't have a lot of time to go through this now, but these are just some elements of first thinking about process. So he introduced to Jackson this human rights charter, commission, and institute to think about, really focused on development, questions of human development and land development, and then some modes of increasing participation in public process, participatory budgeting, people's assemblies. So a lot of participatory actions that bring people together to think about the future of cities. I was down there about 4 or 5 years ago when this was just getting off the ground. I haven't been able to return to see how advanced they are in implementing some of these processes and institutions. But it's a framework that a lot of people talk about, and this is a book for people who may want to take a look at. Another one that Push had spent a lot of time with comes out of the just transition thinking, which started in the labor movement. It was about, it started in coal country, about how do these coal towns grapple with the fact that they're tied to the economy of coal, but know both for economic and climate reasons that they have to transition, but also know that in most economic transitions, working class people and people of color get the raw end of the deal. And so what does a just transition look like in that process? How do workers transition? And so folks in Oakland kind of took some of that thinking, and I don't know how well you can read this, but came up with a methodology for moving from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy. And I'll just read off some of the ways of the thinking about the extractive economy. Extraction is a big one, so digging up, dig and dump, it's called. Exploitation in the labor market, militarism and governance, enclosure of what's the purpose of the government. Well, in this model, it's really the government is built on bringing wealth and power to the wealthiest and most powerful, so it's sort of commandeered or taken over by that interest. And the worldview is consumerism and colonialism. So transitioning all those things through a process of re-examining values, all the way from international scale down to the local, putting a lot of emphasis on place-based, into resources being regenerative, work being cooperative, governance being deeply democratic, purpose being ecological and social well-being, and worldview being caring and sacredness. So that's a lot. It's a lot of abstraction there, but it can play out in a meaningful way when you're thinking about a particular development or a particular decision that a community has to make. Don't have time for this, but I will send out the link there's a national movement for the first time that's coming up with a big housing platform among community organizations across the country, and has had a lot of success getting it adopted by presidential candidates, especially Sanders and Warren, that addresses things like rent control, commodification of housing, housing as a human right. So that's it's becoming a valuable document and way of thinking about it. So I wanted to spend a few minutes looking at this cool map that Keith made for us, hoping that I can. So last week we learned that we have 8,000 publicly owned parcels, more or less, in the city of Buffalo of land. Now, the key here is very helpful in thinking about the types of parcels that public entities, City of Buffalo being the largest holder of these, but on the listing that Keith was able to make for us, there were smaller entities like the fire department or the sewer authority, or I don't know if the police department owns any. I forgot the whole list, but there were 9 or 10 different entities that own public land, and they've come down into these sets of categories. Residential, which would be BMHA, I'm presuming.
Yeah, single families, doubles the city owns.
Yep. Okay, and then a few single families, doubles. Commercial, which would be, I'm just guessing, Keith, you can correct me. I'm thinking Broadway Market would be an example.
HSBC.
HSBC, that's right. So it blew my mind when I started to learn the list of large institutional buildings that we as citizens own. I'll try to name some of them. Kleinhans, what I will always call Pilot Field, I don't know the new name, the baseball stadium. Shays, right? We own that. Science Museum, we own that as Buffalo citizens. Many of these have long-term leases.
Do we have a
with
history museum too?
Yeah, it's part of
so that's another sort of framework, I think, for thinking about the commons, right? That could mean, just a side note there, as part of our commons that we won't have time to fully develop, but we could think about, Buffalo Zoo is another one. We could think, we love all those purposes. We don't want to mess with what Shays does, the zoo does, Pilot Field does, but as public resources, we might have certain expectations about some of the just transition values that should be occurring in those places, like decent living wages, or like decent environmental practices, or decent local hiring practices, whatever they are. I'm not even proposing that right now, but the idea is that we can think big. I'm encouraging us, I'm challenging us to think big about these public assets because they're unique for our city. So community assets, some examples of those would be community centers. So I worked in a city-owned community center for 12 years, so did Keith. And actually Keith ran one, the youth center, and that was the Grant Street Neighborhood Center. It was a library that the city owned. We were able to make the most of it, right? But it was a public asset. So that's another way of thinking about the commons.
a lot of schools.
A lot of schools. And then the one that I think does come to mind more often, like if you asked the person on the street, what's the public land in the city? Well, people would say parks, right? So and that comes on Keith's map. Those do come across as the largest parcels, the green parcels. And then industrial utility and vacant are the grayer ones. And just it's harder a little bit, because they're gray, it's a little harder to see them. But if you dig in, particularly to the east side of Buffalo, you see the density, right? That is a lot of land. I don't know if Keith, percentages in certain districts, but it's, you know, it's 60% on a lot of blocks. Yes.
When you say vacant, there's no structure on the lot.
Presumably, yes. Yep. Yep.
Are
So.
those zones like residential and commercial, or are they?
Keith, could you?
Both, yeah.
Yep, probably both, yeah.
A lot of the corridors, it's commercial.
Yeah. So those, the radial corridors, the streets you can see clearly, you know, were the old commercial streets that were always zoned commercial, and then you had the side streets coming off, and I think, you know, that the point of our exercise in a minute is really to definitely not imagine what each community would want for itself, but to imagine the types of things or the types of projects. And this is something I know Charlie's a pro at, just thinking big about space and how it connects, and what the linkages are and what the uses are, and you know, what the policies are around that land. You can see it correlates really closely to race and class and what I call the rent gap. So I have another map in a minute I'll show where you can see the big capitals, that those bigger banks and hedge fund type investments that are high rent are really, you know, right up against the areas where there are a lot of vacant land. There aren't a whole bunch of them in the deepest parts of the vacant land to this point, but you can see them sort of encircling all that area. So, oh yeah, you want to look west of Main Street? Oops, where's my here? Oops, I think I went down. Those I think are the city's neighborhood categories. Yeah, there are 35 neighborhoods in Buffalo. There's some cool maps of those. They're fun. They're good to learn about.
It's based on census tracts. So in some neighborhoods, you've got 4 or 5 census tracts combined.
Now you can see much less, right, on the west side. Part of that, there's one good news in the center section, which is that Push was able to get a lot of city land, so it no longer appears on this map. So that's somewhat under community control, but there's definitely less. In the lower west, you can see more, right? And then that's still lower west.
Could you go up to Riverside?
Riverside, yeah. Yep, it's kind of west, that lower west density on Black Rock, less in Riverside. And then scattered parcels elsewhere. Okay, so just to wrap up here, I'm just going to really quickly go through a few other what I'm going to call typologies, things that can happen on vacant land to get our imaginations going for the exercise. This was it's now an old map, but that was a push map of some of the vacant land that we had turned into different projects. Obviously, anything would need to go through a deeply rooted community planning process, and there would need to be an infrastructure that kind of works that in tandem with planners like Keith to work at the community level through neighborhood associations and neighborhood organizations to do the planning around what these parcels become. And Push has done a lot of that over the years. Fruit Belt Land Trust has done that. I think some other community organizations have done that. One type that Push had was just mow the lot and build a little tiny installation in front, make it look good, and that's about it. That's all. That's what we call a clean and green lot.
How many of those do they do?
I think we got about 25 or 30 of those, something like that.
And then who maintains them?
And then, so that's another part of it, is the community labor possibilities of doing this. So we have a Push has a small crew, like between 3 and 6 people, depending on the season, that go around and mow it. These are really rough estimates, but just to get people thinking, $2,500 to because as folks who work in this world know, a vacant lot has a lot of grade. It often has ditches in it or old pieces of foundation in it, so it's not as simple as. Community farm is another type of use. So that's one on 14th Street. That was 3 vacant lots together, and that's an after picture. Very peaceful space. It's also kind of a meditative space in there that people go in and sit. I don't know, that's a bad picture, but that's from the roof. So that is more or less a rough estimate of what that one cost. To build the fencing, bring out all the soil, test it, make sure it's graded.
And how did you get the funding for how was the money
Well,
raised?
that was it's a hustle in the nonprofit. That helped me through the community foundation. Through the Western New York Foundation, but we had a lot of foundation support locally and had to keep pitching people on it. Government support. Another important typology is a little bit more impactful when it connects to these larger research questions, which is a rain garden. So that is when you use the lot as a drainage source so that it doesn't enter the sewer system, which we have a chronically overburdened sewer system that pushes raw sewage into the waterways. This, you just dig it up and put some various types of gravel underneath, and then you can do whatever you want over the top of it, more or less. In this case, it was catching the water from the runoff from a parking lot. You can put them anywhere. You can get the downspouts from houses, connect those into the rain gardens.
Did you ever partner with water keepers or river keepers on the
Absolutely, yeah. Some on the Buffalo River we partnered with on, and then partnered in some different consortium. One of them was with the Cleveland Botanic Garden, came up and studied these and tried to create some resources around them. A Riverkeeper is part of. That's another one, just an example of a rain garden. How it works. These are, more futuristic ones. We do have, there's one geothermal lot at Push on Winter Street that helps to heat the adjacent house. It's a geothermal heating system that's buried. It's a pretty narrow lot too, so there's really, the more surface area you get, the more you can heat. But we're able to engineer almost the heating of one house. Falls a little short in some of the coldest months, so we have to have supplemental heat. But and that is this under 5 feet below, a pretty constant temperature, 55, 56 degrees, and through a reverse refrigeration process, you can extract that heat and run it through the floor, run the water through the floorboards. Not exactly. Again, this is a rough estimate because so much of ours was donated. Not exactly cost effective until you get a little bit more houses served by a single system. That's not a lot exactly, but green roofs, I guess, are part of the future of cities. That's at 5 points on top of one of the Push buildings.
That's a Push building? 5 points?
Yep. Yeah, Push has 2 buildings at 5 points where the Black Monarchy store is.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Near
I
Remedy
was
House?
thinking you were saying bakery was a Push property.
No.
Just one of the properties
At
on-
5 points.
Right.
Yeah.
Near Remedy House?
Yeah, it's kitty corner from it. Yep.
Okay.
That's not the right. That's not the right one. Sorry about that. This is something that I think Jocelyn has done, and building new housing on lots is obviously a big use. It's the way that Push did it, and the way that is the only responsible way we could figure out how to do it, as Jocelyn said, is very expensive. There are individuals I know there is a guy I know who built his own house in Buffalo in the last 2 years, but he cut different corners and doesn't have to abide by all the codes that we had to abide by. So to put new housing, that's the rough estimate I came up with. there are things that can bring that down a little bit, but it's just not cheap. Yeah, so well, you could do the 2 like that.
Okay.
You could do 1, you know, but or you could do 4, you know, and adjust a little bit.
But that includes like high energy efficiency and things like that.
Yeah,
right?
decent standards, good standards on green building for sure. This isn't a lot, but as we saw from our map, there are a lot of these scattered around the city that are part of our commons, vacant city buildings. So this was the one that Keith ran very successfully for many years, making it like one of the most vital youth centers in town. And it was a function of just being in the right place at the right time when it went vacant, having an organization that Push was just getting off the ground and said, sure, we'll try to figure out what to do with this, and through a lot of different experiments, we came up with a model that more or less, you know, was pretty successful. But a big part of any commons, I think, is claiming the public space that's already there.
Where is this?
That's at Grant Street, 271,
Grant. Oh.
right across from Gershio's.
Oh, okay.
Is that in any way still part of Push?
It absolutely is. Yeah, it has its own brand, I guess, but it's still very much part of Push. It's Grant Street Neighborhood Center. And maybe when we get to the next phase, Keith could say a little bit more about that. And, you know, cost is contingent. Keith built that program on a shoestring. And we never, you know, it's still very much a shoestring. Same with, this was public land that was the community repurposed through Push, a dead park, I would call it, and made it a live park. Yeah, that's on Mass. And then another type of city building. Keith mentioned there are a lot of these schools scattered around that are vacant. This was School 77. It's now, I don't have an after picture, I have a during picture. Again, maximizing the potential for it to hire locally, pay decently, include training, include green building standards, be participatory in how that was planned. And that's really, all those things are things that the Commons can do. Have a cultural component built into it, have a youth component.
What was that?
That's School 77. Sorry, that's
okay.
Now housing, affordable housing on the top for seniors.
Great.
3 nonprofits, including Push on the ground floor, and gymnasium. And it's also part of the energy transition because it has has the first low-income community-owned solar array in New York State on it.
Oh,
So,
that's awesome.
Last slide here is not Buffalo, but I didn't immediately find like cultural slides for vacant lots in my slides. So I have a friend here who's from Spain, here for 4 years. So we got to figure out how to work with him. His wife is at UB, who is an expert, gone around the world doing public art projects on vacant land. And this is one in Bogota, Colombia. And it just says arriba los de abajo, so rise up, those from the bottom. And it's, you know, it's a community planned, community constructed project on vacant space. I believe, I mean, it's still there, I know that. I believe it was built to be there forever. I'm not sure if it has like a 10-year life or not, but it's definitely like at least semi-permanent. So it's there. As we go out, as I give the charge for this exercise, this is Keith's map with me superimposing projects on what I would call that rent gap line that are very high rent. Going on or either built in the last 2 years or 3 years or just announced. So we've got, you know, Main Street being a big corridor for them, and then a little bit across Main Street, like the Simonelli one at Central Park, like the one just announced in Denise's neighborhood this past week, in the Fruit Belt. You know, Niagara being another big corridor for them, and then some deeper in the west side. What's that Black Rock one
Is that the one that you were talking about last week? That
Oh yeah, that's Chandler Street.
Chandler.
Yeah, that's Chandler Street. I might have it off a little bit, but it's more or less Chandler Street. Then you have some interesting ones. You got a new one in the old Chase Theater on Seneca Street. You have some along the Ohio River. I missed a lot. This is just the ones that I can think of off the top of my head. But the point is, you can see them kind of encircling the heavy commons area, vacant land, not really entering into too much of that space yet, but trying to transform the market upward on the periphery. So I'm not going to go through that again. I'll just end with this this is just something Dr. Taylor, who is a good thinker on this stuff, just put up 2 days ago on his Facebook that I just liked as a very succinct summary of essentially my position on growth too. So just thinking, when black radicals say free the land, they're talking about the market dynamics conjoined with real estate capitalism. The market-based development model, real estate capitalism, produces uneven urban development, which consists of two poles: the blighting or underdevelopment of certain parts of the city combined with the renewal, gentrification, and development of other parts. Thus, ghettoization and renewal are the conjoined outcomes of real estate capitalism and the city building process. So our charge is to do something different and alter that model. And this is the exercise. So for today, first I want to do this in split up in four little groups. So we could just do the first 2.5 table. If one of you could come up to this group, so front, back. I think you can figure out how to split exactly. You don't have to split. Yes, I'll just walk us through this. So the first part of the exercise for 5 minutes is back to our brainstorming. We have these charts here. I don't know if, Christy, did we end up finding markers yet? Or okay. So I want each group to brainstorm everything you can think of that would impede this imaginative, big thinking idea for our commons. Spend 5 minutes doing as much as you can of that, and then we're going to just put all those aside and pretend they don't exist for the next part of the exercise. The meat of the exercise is each group coming up with 20, and if you end up having 14, that's okay, but I want you to aim high. 20 uses of vacant land parcels. And when I say vacant land, I also mean some of those vacant city-owned structures, the schools, the other vacant city assets. You can think of them either as individual parcels, so it could be a rain garden on a vacant lot, or you could think of them as a network of parcels, like a corridor for apple trees, an apple orchard that's networked through the city, that could serve as typologies for a community planning exercise. So the idea is you could take your list and we could partner with a community organization in Kensington Bailey, say, and use it as a starting point for people to think imaginatively about the land in their community. So again, it's brainstorming. You don't have to go deep on them. You can use some of the ones I already showed you, but I want you to also think beyond them. I'm sure we can get our creative juices flowing, and then we'll report back. Is that clear enough? Could that group be ready to report back?
Sure.
We're still selecting the things we specifically like to say.
20 more seconds. 20 seconds, that's it. I'm going to get back on the board here.
Tiny house, I like the Fairness Library idea. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, I like
do you want
I like those impediments.
No, it's
wintertime stuff.
the wintertime stuff. I didn't even thought about that, but that could be its whole.
Things like this.
Yeah.
To come in more.
small businesses.
I love that one. Spa. or you know,
sauna.
sauna.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
like
Yeah.
Swedish culture. They're everywhere.
We should
I love a sauna culture.
Sauna culture is there. Okay. Okay. Is Liam's group ready to go?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, Liam's group is ready to go. Is Liam the reporter? I'm guessing he is.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm really waiting.
But let's make sure everyone's paying attention.
So, in our group, we came up with a lot of ideas, but some of the ones that we thought were our personal favorites were charging, like electric charging stations for electric vehicles, to encourage the use of electric vehicles, and also to encourage the city to adopt more electric vehicles, so it's more convenient to use them.
Score.
We also liked concert venues and theater spaces, so that like local bands or theater troupes or whatever could like schedule these, schedule appointments, and people could just go and enjoy themselves and have like a fun time. And it'd be a great way to encourage like cultural activity in the area, and I think that's encourage the arts, and I think it's a really good way to make it like a nicer place to be. I also we had fitness facilities, track trail. That's also connected to like pools and things. Not only does it help encourage public health and well-being and fitness, which is all really good. Those things are often very expensive to get like a membership to like a private corporate fitness center. So being able to bring down the cost of fitness to like lower income people who often have trouble finding like maybe affordable healthy food, they can still get like some fitness via like a public fitness center, track field, whatever, right? We also had an idea of like a tiny house village, which was a thing that some people have done in other places where they build like these tiny houses that were cheap to build and looked very pretty, and they could give them to people who maybe couldn't afford a mortgage on like a bigger house, right? But they could through like a nonprofit organization be able to eventually come to own these very small, cheap to build and very pretty looking houses. So it gives like a neighborhood a kind of charm, and is also a good way to create affordable housing. We also had an idea for libraries of various kinds. So everyone knows about book libraries, but there could be libraries for tools and instruments and things like that, right? Toys. Where if you can't afford like a tool you need in order to do a thing, you can just go and take it, and as long as you bring it back, you're good, right? I think that's really cool, right? Instruments are often very expensive, but expression of yourself through music shouldn't really have a paywall. So allowing people to go and get musical instruments without having to dish out $1,000 is good. The other thing kind of connected to that was a public kind of recording studio, because if you want to go and record anything in like a real professional recording studio, you're going to have to pay a whole lot of money to do that. So I think having like a public recording studio where you can just go and you can, maybe you'd have like instructions or like a brief training on how to actually operate everything safely and effectively, so that you can, record things and whatever, right, without having to, dish out like thousands and thousands of dollars for a professional recording studio. So those were, we also had small business incubators, job training programs, and like maybe some food distribution kinds of things. Which was all like a kind of like a group of ideas that were all about, trying to encourage people to get training in jobs, and also trying to hire people, and also trying to, build up the economy in the area. So those were some of our like personal favorite ideas from our list.
Excellent report, Liam. Any questions for Liam or that group around any things that they presented? Great ideas. So Christy, I guess we'll work on capturing these, taking pictures too. And synthesizing. Let's go this way to this group. I don't know who the.
All right, we at the top of the list here, the first one we had was a high quality solar on fire departments, huge buildings with huge roofs scattered around the city that energy could be distributed. Also connected to green rooftop gardens that could be on police stations, it could be libraries, or any public school should have something that is energy efficient on it, or creates energy. We have outdoor classrooms, so beautiful spaces to do outdoor teaching and learning. transitioning vacant city-owned buildings to high-quality affordable housing, so these could be like cooperatively owned or rent to own, similar to School 77. Multi-use community-controlled community centers, where there's community kitchens, there could be space for restorative justice circles, warming centers during the cold seasons. And then we have playgrounds and more playgrounds and instrument parks, which I guess are parks that include large instruments which you can play collectively. You might have to say more about that. And then senior community sites modernized with legitimate services for seniors in the city.
Awesome, and I kind of do want to hear a little more about instrument parks. That sounds like an awesome. Do those exist in some places?
So they're really big instruments, and so they can have chimes and drums, and so it's just a great place for people to convene, kids to play, make noise.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and it does remind me on the shared kitchen, which we do have some of in semi-public spaces, but that Toronto does have a bread hearth network in some of its parks where there are bread ovens. I don't know how much they're used, but interspersed throughout.
So down in Wellsville, they took a vacant lot and they built this labyrinth-shaped gardens.
Labyrinth.
And then in between, they wanted it to be handicap accessible, so you could go around. And then all the community nonprofits come and they plant the kids flowers and food. And then they have instrument parks around. And then they were doing kind of a mosaic competition to build a back wall.
Wow, that's in Cattaraugus, Wellsville, Cattaraugus County?
In
Allegheny County, yeah.
And it was kind of community led, and it's kind of an interesting
Awesome,
process.
yeah. Cool, any questions for their uses or anything that springs to mind? Okay, let's go up to this group. See some nice graphics over here.
Well, you're in the tour buff region when the bread ovens, here we go, public baking oven comes in there.
Okay, yeah,
One
tour
thing
buff.
we thought is to designate, not all, but many of them like to think about how they might be connected.
Yes,
to think
the
of a
crucial
connection between the parcels, so you can get from one to the other. We thought of a number of the things that came up in other places, including fitness space, art space. We're also thinking about different ways to frame it, though. That if we're going to try to draw in foundation money, for example, like big money would follow big vision. So we try to think about what kinds of things might connect with that. One of the ideas we talked about is a blue economy framework where you focus on water resources, things like aquaponics. The rain gardens that were mentioned earlier, so that might be an idea about how to think about resources that could be low maintenance, passive, yet effective. Yeah.
Awesome.
I like the public baking oven.
Yeah, no, it's. Oh, we got a bread baker here.
It's
Yeah.
a buff region.
It's such an interesting
buff
idea.
Chester.
Y'all come, throw your stuff in there.
Yeah.
We've seen a couple out.
Dumping their hands in a 600-degree oven.
Does anyone have a favorite public theater stage that they can think of? 'Cause I've seen some that are somewhat underutilized or deadened by the configurations, and then some that work. But anyone come to mind of like in the round or just a amphitheater type
You mean
model?
like a space that's in existence?
Yeah, an
right now?
amphitheater that's like on public land that could be a good model for it.
Shakespeare in the Park is pretty good.
Shakespeare in the Park.
For around here, it's the gold standard.
Okay.
But
it's semi-permanent. It's seasonal, which I
right,
guess.
it goes away, and you're jailed for trespassing if you're not part of the production. So. But something that could be, but I would think something more in the round, like a gazebo type.
Has anybody been to Stacks in Toronto?
No.
Know about that?
Tell us about that.
So they use old, the storage trucks. What was the hot dog place that?
The shipping containers.
Shipping
Yeah.
containers. entertainment.
Entertainment space.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Cool.
So it's all, little independent coffee shops and stuff. I mean, that's not what we're thinking.
No,
but
no,
the fact
yeah.
that they use this outside space with big rocks and stuff that people could perform, it's worth going up to that as well.
I
What
do
about
want.
Art Park, is that, who?
That's
Art Park in Lewiston, is
it's a
that?
state park.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's a
That's pretty
version
gorgeous.
of. Yep, it is.
And they do a lot of stuff there.
I just want to point out, I don't know if Peter stressed it, but just they do have the winter use lot, like to think about it as a special category in Buffalo.
Yeah.
So it was what would a fairly low maintenance winter purposed lot look like?
You just freeze it, nice for.
So there's rinks. Yeah.
It's good be for cross-country skiing.
Cross-country
Yeah,
ski
yeah.
networks.
Snowshoeing.
There we go. Snowshoeing, cross-country.
Weight class on that connected.
Mm-hmm. Okay, last group, please.
Yeah, so we grouped our ideas into looks like 6 categories here. I guess I'll start. So housing, all different types of housing, single family, multifamily. Some of the things I think we talked about last week with community land trusts and cooperative housing and ownership, and different types of development. So focusing on transit-oriented development. So after housing, we sort of grouped things around community amenities, so which we named up here as rebuilding neighborhoods. So the things that we need to put back into neighborhoods that have been divested from. So access to healthcare facilities, grocery shopping, childcare, schools, playgrounds, all the sorts of things that should go with and close to housing. We then have commercial corridors for a little bit of an extension from that, but cafes, restaurants, offices, local businesses, things like that. I guess I can skip down. So number 6 here, so social services and then entrepreneurship, which I think we sort of stole from you guys, thinking about small business incubators, things to prop up developing those commercial centers. And then so we have health, wellness, and art. What fell under that? So I think this maybe overlaps with what other folks were saying, thinking about either indoor or outdoor health and fitness facilities. And then also linking that to things like nature walks and these sort of ideas of network trails. However that's envisioned, whether it's public art spaces or just having people have access to green space. And then our last one is, which I wrote, green and transit, which down here we had green spaces, wildlife conservation, open space, and then stormwater management, which I think carries over into infrastructure. And that's maybe the last one I'll say, is that we had, from our impediments, we were talking about issues with existing public transportation and declining infrastructure. So making sure that all of these things are connected with appropriate access, whether that's improving streetscapes and things like that.
Awesome. Any questions for these folks? Great. So do need to clarify. So the last class is I had to make a decision, and given some of the constraints that I have to do it on the 9th, which is 2 weeks. I know a few folks weren't going to be able to be there. So 2 weeks from today will be the last class. I won't reveal the whole thrust of it. I'm going to synthesize some of this and sort of help to package it in a way that could move it forward, and also talk about power analysis, campaigning, and framing some of what Peter talked about, and thinking about how to frame the commons and how to organize around it. So hope everyone can make the last class. And
Just wondered if you guys saw today's Buffalo News. I was saying it to Christy. There's going back to your first workshop and the history of Buffalo and the Holland Land Company. The entire photo page is photographs of a Holland Land Company museum. I noticed there was no mention of who was here
Indigenous
before
people,
then, or
yeah.
how that was taken, but
Yeah. Yeah, I did see that.
Yeah.
You know, like there've been 3 or 4 articles this week that hit on themes like that Invest
Sam
Buffalo
McGavin was in
one that I sent out too. So cool. Thanks for coming, and we'll adjourn till 2 weeks. So.